Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Jack Joseph and Morton Mandel Center for Studies in Jewish Education at Brandeis University. I'm John Levison. I'm director of the Mandel Center, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this special event, which we are co-hosting with the Grant Center for the American Jewish Experience at Tulane University and the Journal of Jewish Education. Today's event is part of our work at the Mandel Center to support scholarship related to Jewish education and to share important ideas with the field of Jewish education. And with that very brief introduction, I want to pass the baton to my friend and colleague, Ilana Horowitz, who will be moderating today's session. Ilana is the Fields Rayant Chair in Contemporary Jewish Life at Tulane, and she was one of the editors of the special issue of the Journal of Jewish Education on Race and Ethnicity. Ilana, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, John. Welcome, everyone, to this special webinar. Again, my name is Dr. Ilana Horowitz. I'm an assistant professor of Jewish Studies and Sociology at Tulane University, where I hold the Fields Rayant Chair in Contemporary Jewish Life. And I'm really excited today to discuss and celebrate the contributions of 4 amazing scholars who have recently shared their work in a special themed issue of the Journal of Jewish Education about how issues of race, ethnicity, and immigration shape and intersect with Jewish education. The motivation behind this special issue, which I had the honor of guest editing alongside Dr. Michal Biton, who unfortunately could not join us today, stemmed from a recognition of the necessity to expand and reframe dominant narratives about Jewish education, both here in the United States and in Israel. The 4 articles in this special issue focus on challenges faced by Jewish Ethiopian refugees, Sephardic communities, Israeli American parents, and Latin Jewish families. This issue, titled Towards Greater Inclusion in Jewish Education, Exploring Diverse Jewish Educational Experiences, is not just a collection of articles. It really represents a meaningful dialogue that challenges the prevailing norms of Jewish educational spaces and spotlights the experiences of underrepresented communities, hopefully offering fresh perspectives to foster equitable and inclusive environments. And we are pleased to announce that the 4 articles and the editor's special introduction to this issue are available for free download as opposed to sitting behind a paywall. So please check the link in the chat to access these valuable resources. As many of you know, scholarly journals are traditionally platforms for academic conversation among scholars, but often this dialogue does not extend beyond the pages of the journals themselves. Researchers often spend years crafting their studies, yet seldom have the opportunity to engage directly with each other or with practitioners who might actually implement their findings in meaningful ways. Consequently, much of the valuable research remains behind paywalls, limiting its potential impact. And our goal today is really to change that dynamic. We aim to create a forum where scholars can not only present their work, but also engage in a broader conversation with each other and with you, the audience. By doing so, we hope to encourage these discussions to move off the journal pages and into real-world contexts, potentially inspiring future research and influencing practice in Jewish education. Now for some logistical things. Today's session is going to run approximately 75 minutes. I have prepared 5 questions that some or all of the panelists will respond to. And let me use this opportunity to tell you who the panelists are, and their full titles are in the chat. We have Hannah Kober from Stanford University, Marva Shalev Marom from the Schechter Institutes, Ilana Ryback-Rand from Yeshiva University, and Ariella Rone-Jenich of Olamim. I encourage our audience to actively engage with our panelists by submitting their questions into the Q&A button. Using the Q&A button throughout the webinar, I will take these questions towards the end. Please note that we are recording today's session. It will be available afterwards on the Mandel Center website, on a YouTube channel, and as part of the Brandeis Mandel Center podcast series, which will allow you to revisit the insightful discussions at your convenience. Again, Thank you for joining us for this important conversation, and I look forward to a lively and insightful discussion. So with that introduction, I'm going to start off with a question that I would love everybody, all of my panelists to answer. And Marva, I'll start with you. And here's the question. Could each of you start by sharing the story behind your article? What's the story behind the story? What inspired you to explore this particular topic within Jewish education? And were there any personal experiences or observations that shaped your approach and focus? So go ahead, Marva.
Well, Ilana, thank you so very much for this wonderful introduction and for letting me be the first to jump in. I have to, this question, I'm tempted to tell you the entire story of my life, so I will only tell exactly what brought me to research this unique community in Ethiopia. Basically, my relationship with the Jewish Ethiopian community in Israel started in the army. I was a teacher soldier during my obligatory army service, and I was stationed to work with immigrants, kids who just immigrated from wherever in the world, and to teach them Hebrew. But when I arrived to a new settlement of newly arrived immigrants from Ethiopia in Gedera, in the southern periphery of Israel, I had no idea who were these people, and I never encountered them before in my life. What they wanted was to learn music and guitar, not Hebrew. And from that moment onwards, basically until I started my PhD with your wonderful help and advising, I was a music teacher. I was a guitar teacher working with kids of Ethiopian descent in just a few places in Israel. At the height of it, I had my own little music center. It used to be a vegetable shop, and we turned it into a music center, basically. And when I realized I wanted to research Jewish education and not just to experiment with it in informal education, I knew that those I want to do it with were my students of many years, those students of Ethiopian descent. But you know, all this time, I never asked them any single question about their Jewish identity, where they came from, and how their parents practiced Judaism, and what happens at school, and how do these things go together. So I basically learned from my mistakes. And my first mistake was to ask one of my research participants, Mulu, who you will hear more about later. She was my guitar teacher, my guitar student since she was 8. And when she was 12, we started this research. And I asked her, Mulu, where did you learn, Jewishness and everything in Israel? Did you learn it at school? Did you learn it at home? And she was like, no, stupid, I learned it in Ethiopia. And I was like, what do you mean? She said, well, we waited for many years before we came to Israel. And there was a little community center. We did the prayers there. We ate and we learned Torah. And gradually we made it to Israel, and we were able to pass through the conversion that we have to do to become citizens. And that was just so much information for me. I had no idea that this was what actually was going on, but I knew that my responsibility as a researcher was to go to where she learned to be a Jew in the Israeli way, back to Ethiopia, and to see how does that community, what happens there? How does that jive with what we see in Israel? And so you ask what shaped my perspective. I think the first thing was just, love. We were very, like many years, the 4 girls that did this research with me, we know each other for a very long time. And I knew from the first moment on that I am going to work with people that their lives are much greater than the papers I'm going to write. And so that perspective really made many things that were automatic in research not that automatic. And the other thing that shaped my perspective, unfortunately, we'll talk more about that later, was being a Ferengi, a white Ashkenazi, that I had to relearn all the time and to decompose the knowledge that my pre-existing knowledge in order to really understand this reality. The one thing I want to say, like the last thing in this sense, that coming from informal education, it made me really appreciate what I saw in Ethiopia much more, and actually try to see what is the contribution of this strange and esoteric scene to the entire field of Jewish education is actually in understanding what informal Jewish education is about. So yes, a long answer to your question.
Amazing. Thank you. Ariella, I'm going to have you go next. And by the way, I did not prep people what order they were going in. So this is a bit of a surprise for people.
Well, I'm happy I'm going next because I so relate to entering research as a practitioner, really, and with the questions of a practitioner. This research on Latin Jewish families and the way that they navigate their intersecting identities as they raise their kids and make educational choices was something I was going through when I started this research. In 2020, I had a 1-year-old that then became a 2-year-old, and this impending question of how I would raise a child as actually Mexican, Jewish, and Persian child, and what that meant for me as a Mexican Jew about having community and having my own culture and language reflected in my own family really became important. And as my first attempt was to create a program and to create a context to have those relationships and to be able to live out those cultural aspirations. But I quickly found that if I wanted to create something, I needed to learn more about the experiences of other Latin Jewish families. So I quickly pivoted into research mode from practitioner mode, and then came back around and really used that research to help bolster our approach to our programming at Olamim. And so I felt that it was an amazing experience to be both a researcher and a practitioner that had a very personal relationship to what I was studying, that had very deep connections, as Marva said, to the people that I was learning from. And one thing that was very special about the interview process was that it was a discovery process for all of us in learning more about how we understand ourselves, how we understand our families, the dynamics within our families as we negotiate identity, language, culture, and educational decision-making. And so it was always professional and personal, practitioner, researcher. So it's really been a wonderful opportunity to engage in that way.
Thanks so much. And yeah, Ariella and Marva, the reason I had you guys go first and next to each other is because I think of the 4 authors and reading the articles, I think the 2 of you were the most sort of immersed personally in the spaces that you were studying. And so thinking about sort of issues of positionality and methods and the level of community interaction that you had with your participants, I think was really unique or different from Ilana and Hannah. So Ilana, tell us about how you came. What's the story behind your article? How did you come to it?
Hi, thank you so much for having me. So I often get asked this question when people say, how did you get interested in studying Sephardic communities? Because they say, you don't look Sephardi, and I say, I'm not. But I grew up in Queens. So that is really my introduction to this world. I grew up in Queens in the 90s. Queens is, by some reports, the most diverse place on earth. And in the 90s, there were a lot of demographic shifts. So I grew up going to a Jewish day school, and my grade in middle school was a wonderful mix of Queens Jewish diversity. There were people who identified as Bukharian, as Georgian, as Persian, as Israeli, as Moroccan. I'm sure I'm forgetting some, but it was really a really diverse class in high school as well. And we all just kind of got along with each other. I never, at least I got along with everybody. I didn't think that it was unusual. I just thought that that's what most Jewish communities were like. And then I returned to teach English in a high school in Queens, the same high school that I went to actually. And as a teacher, I was noticing something that I didn't notice when I was a student, which is that I couldn't put my finger on it, but somehow it seemed as though the non-Ashkenazi students were experiencing school differently than the Ashkenazi students were. Some of it came through in English classes, certain characters that resonated with students coming from different backgrounds than with students who grew up with American parents. And for my master's program in English, in teaching of English, I worked with some English language learners on developing literacy skills. These were all students who were first-generation Americans, were growing up in non-Ashkenazi households, and it was clear through our discussions that the differences they were experiencing from school and home were somehow deeper and more intangible than simple linguistic differences. And I wanted to explore those. So what my paper is about is a subtopic drawn from my dissertation, which was about how discontinuities between the school and the home can impact adolescents' social and emotional well-being. In other words, when there are behaviors in the home that are then discontinued in the school, what does that mean for a student? If we think of a student as developing in a bunch of different networks and social environments, well, what happens when those networks are at odds with each other? And what does that mean for a student's well-being? And that was the focus of my research, and specifically, how does school culture moderate that impact? How does the approach of the school, the underlying assumptions of the school, the language of the teachers, the curriculum, the behaviors of all of the staff, how does that all impact these students' experiences, and how does that perhaps moderate the effects of those discontinuities? So my dissertation was a broader project. It was a mixed methods project. I interviewed adults who had gone through the K through 12 Jewish day school system to see, well, what were the patterns that they noticed as they were going through the school system that strike them now when they're adults as having been discontinuous? And what were the things in schools that helped, and what were the things that perhaps exacerbated the circumstances? And so the paper for this journal is drawn from those interviews, specifically as it relates to Tefillah and curriculum.
Thank you so much. All right, last but not least, Hannah.
Thanks
Tell
for
us the story behind your article.
I'd love to. Thanks for convening us today. I'd like to answer this in two different ways. One is semi-autobiographical, and the other is more follows the pathway once I started grad school and where different life events led me. And I'll start with the latter. So I started my doctoral program in the fall of 2019, and I had come in with really intense interest in trying to problem solve around why so many students in American Jewish education plateau in their Hebrew learning at such a young age. And I wanted to understand which factors contributed to it. And I was specifically interested in classroom interaction, student-teacher interaction, accent correction. I'm an applied linguist by training. And as much as I wanted to do that work, I wanted to do an ethnography in a school. Schools were not especially interested in having non-essential human beings around. In the spring of 2020, when I embarked on that project. And like so many others during that time period, I was doom scrolling on Facebook, and I saw an ad for an initiative that was interested in having Hebrew instituted in public schools in Los Angeles, and they were invested in having Hebrew offered as a second language. But essentially, this initiative was coming out of the Israeli expat community in LA. And as somebody who had focused a lot on Hebrew education and the history of Hebrew education in the United States, I said, this is somewhat unprecedented, because most of these efforts had come out of non-Israeli populations across the country. And this was sort of a move of increased vocality and advocacy for Hebrew learning on their own terms. And I was interested specifically in how this group of volunteers and parents primarily identified their own needs vis-a-vis what they thought were the needs of the other learners of Hebrew in the broader Los Angeles area. And that situated my work. And essentially what I realized I was doing was just flipping the script and focusing on a less represented community and reframing them as consumers of Hebrew learning as opposed to simply producers of Hebrew learning, and leaning into some of the insecurities that these parents have, which flouted the assumptions, I think, of some previous research, which I will say was more comfortable with the idea of Israeli self-sustaining their Hebrew usage and Hebrew learning. They were less dependent on Jewish institutions or less dependent on public institutions that sometimes offer us our particularistic resources. And the semi-autobiographical piece is very similar to Alana. I love that there's this synthesis over here. So I grew up in Queens as well, also in the 90s. And I grew up very adjacent to the Israeli community in central Queens. I went to a different day school in a similar area that had about a 70% Israeli student body. And that really gave me a different perspective on the purpose of Jewish education and also the stakeholders in Jewish education, which I'll talk more about a little bit later. And it's with that experience and the questions that I had growing up in that environment and with Hebrew education being presented to me in that environment, I felt well positioned to dive into this project head first.
Yeah, and in thinking about the synthesis between the different articles from my seat or role as the guest editor, one of the other things that was fun to see and notice is how both Ariella and Hannah's articles, the focus was really on parents. And so for people listening to this who are interested in parents' perspectives and how those shape Jewish education, I really want to highlight those two articles being an interesting conversation with one another. And from a methodological perspective, I think all four of you did qualitative articles, but the extent to which the sort of ways in which you went about those inquiries was really different. And so it's interesting to look at the range of qualitative methodologies and the extent to which you each embedded yourself in the communities that you were studying. So I urge you all to look at the articles with that lens as well. I'm going to ask the next question, and this is two separate questions. So two people respond to one and another two people respond to the other. And this has to do with the implications of your research for both for the scholarly community and the practitioner community. So I'm going to start with the scholarly community, and I'm going to have, I think, Marva and Hannah reply to this. So as a result of your research, what are some of the key ideas or assumptions that you hope scholars will reconsider or think differently about within the field of Jewish education? How do you envision your findings influencing the academic discourse or reshaping existing paradigms? So Hannah, I'll start with you.
So I guess the first main implication I'll start with is about stakeholders, like I mentioned in passing in my introduction, which is that I was trying to capture a growing demographic, a growing sector of the American Jewish community that in the context of my study was starting to, I have a sore throat, I'm sorry, starting to advocate for resources that in their view fit their needs better than extant Hebrew learning resources that are available are pretty pervasive in the area. And the reason why I think it was important for scholars to contend with this is because there's I guess I'll start with from the perspective of Jewish education researchers. There sometimes is a sort of monolithic mental model of what an American Jewish learner is, what their concerns are, what families they come from, what sort of religious observance levels they have, where their families have come from. And a lot of these are themes that others are going to be speaking about today. And what my study does, I think, is opens that box and allows us to think a little bit more critically about who learners are in Jewish institutions. And obviously, this can be an implication for practitioners as well, but for those who are asking good questions about what is happening in American Jewish education, that is a really good place to start. And the second piece, and I'm speaking both to people who are doing research in Hebrew language education and people who might be thinking about this from outside of a Jewish context, what my study also does is presents an alternative model of what heritage language learning looks like. Because what's happening in the study is these parents are advocating for an alternative model to what is available to them already in the market of heritage learning opportunities. And what that does is it creates a little bit of a split, or maybe a Venn diagram, we could say, of how they perceive their own learning needs and how they perceive the learning needs of the other community and how that's institutionally represented. And what these parents think heritage language learning is, and what they think their purpose of Hebrew transmission for their kids is, undergirds those beliefs. And that's also important, especially for folks who are, when they think about heritage language learning, they might be thinking about, if you come from a particular country and you come to a host country, there will be institutions that, if they are offering your language, instruction in your language, or immersion opportunities in your language, it will be a direct mapping between, we can piece that apart another time. But there's an assumption that there is some sort of correlation there. And here, the parents are sometimes expressing discomfort with the idea that Hebrew is being offered exclusively in Jewish settings when they're used to it being a sort of secular national language, cultural language, right? And both of those are key ideas that I think can make waves in multiple different areas.
Amazing. Thank you. All right, Marva, tell us what, from your perspective, is the significant scholarly contribution of your work. What are you hoping people are thinking differently about as a result of reading your paper?
Wow. Okay, that's a big one. You really assume they do, right? They read it. So what I want to say is, one of my favorite Buddhist sayings actually is, the eye cannot see itself. How could it see another? And that question was really, really important for me as I became a scholar of the Jewish Ethiopian community in Israel and abroad. I used to be a practitioner, and I thought, or at least research tells you, that you research the other, right? You look at somebody else and you see things about them. But I think that the real teaching for me was to realize that even when we talk about this remote community in Ethiopia, the very last remaining Ethiopian Jews who did not receive permission to make Aliyah as Jews to Israel, when I was talking about them, I was actually talking about what it means to be a Jew in Israel and how you get there. That question is so disciplinarily complex. It's about state work, it's about traditions, it's about antiquity. And I had so many choices and so many places to fail. And I had two really important obstacles that I hope that from them, or from the way I tried, I'm not sure that I combated them well. And I think it's a life journey to learn how to do it. But I hope that there are two things that readers could gain from this article, or at least that I gained from writing it. The first one is actually a methodological piece. I told you that when I started this research, I went back to the community that I was, the guitar teacher, but I came back without a guitar, but with IRB forms. And at that point, no mother mothers that I would sit with them for buna, for coffee, nobody would talk to me. They didn't let me enter into their homes. And I was just so insulted. I didn't know what happened. 1 year in America, I started to cry, obviously. And then Mulu, that I told you about her earlier, she told me, just stop chasing me with these silly papers. My mother is not even your problem, her signature. I want to do this research. I want to be here with my own name. Let me handle her. She's not what you need to worry about. Your problem is that you don't ask the right questions. You don't speak with the right people. And generally, you have no idea what you're talking about. And that quote, I quoted in every lecture I give, because it was really the most important teaching that I had. That first of all, I am the learner here. The people who are leading are the experts. And I hope that this actually comes through in the article, but what I tried to do was really to enable them to lead. I also broke my leg a couple of days after I received the funding to take us all to Ethiopia. And I ended up going on crutches, looking very differently from everyone else, not speaking Amharic. And I thought to myself, you know what, if we need to equalize power relations in research, so maybe that's the way to do it, to get cameras for these girls and to enable them to do data collection. And from that, I think most of the data that we collected that summer, it was the girls that collected the data. And they were much closer to their community members, they grew up in that place. Some of them still have family members who were waiting there. And I hope that methodologically, at least, readers could gain insight into how much our participants are really the the participant researchers, maybe, not research participants. And I truly loved, like from that moment on, I started learning and really becoming curious about community-based research models from public health, from education, but that as educators and Jewish educators, we can learn a lot from these methods that enable us to equalize the power relations in research. But I also had to equalize the power relations outside of research. And that is a really key point, because and that brings us back to the idea of what it means to be a Jew in Israel, because this community is being left behind because their Jewish identity is suspected. But when you go into the roots of that suspicion, you need to go back to the first Babylonian exile depicted in the Bible and to the tribe of Dan that left to the Egypt and went down to Gondar and Tigray and stayed there ever since in their histories. And so we cannot really understand why Ethiopian Judaism is being undermined in Israel if we don't consider the Rabbinic Revolution, for instance. And how can I consider both Israeli statecraft and a Rabbinic Revolution at the same time? And so these things, I'm not sure. I tried to do the best work I could right now, and I'm still in the beginning of my career. So I hope to become more able to handle these complexities. But that was really what I had to keep in mind, always the very, very ancient and very foundational and fundamental issues that are at hand, at the same time that there is power, like we know it, state power, immigration authorities, that you know, Jewish. I think the one thing that I hope scholars would see is a little bit to denaturalize Israel's rearticulation of Jewish identity, as if what it means to be a Jew in Israel is actually what a Jew is, and not the entire diversity of the Jewish world. And I hope that after reading this, Jews from across the world will not continue being suspicious about the Jewish roots of this community, but actually ask themselves, how could we be a worldwide community with this group inside?
My vantage point as the guest editor, and this is a special issue just to remind the audience about race, ethnicity, and immigration. And I think immigration plays an interesting role in thinking about how your two papers, Hannah and Marva, are in conversation with one another, because in the case of Hannah, right, you have Israelis emigrating into the United States and sort of grappling with their Jewish identity in the US context from Israel, whereas Marva, you have Ethiopians immigrating to Israel and grappling with their Jewish identity in Israel. And so from the thinking about what is the role of immigration in the story of Jewish education, your two papers speak really nicely to each other. Right. So I'm going to move us along to the next question, which is for Ariella and Ilana. Based on your findings, what do you think are the most significant shifts in perspective or practice that you hope to see among educators or other practitioners in Jewish education? How do you envision your research influencing their approaches to creating more inclusive and culturally responsive educational environments? Ariella, I'll start with you.
Thank you. You know, and it's sometimes hard to get back into my research because I'm so captivated by what my fellow researchers are describing and nodding so much, because there's so much overlap there in how our lens needs to go really big in asking all these questions. I think sometimes educational institutions, and for sure Jewish educational institutions, are very focused on the what. What should we do? And what should we not do anymore, right? And I think we have stopped asking the question of what's happening. Our community is changing so much that we need to ask what's happening before we decide what to do as practitioners. Certainly in the Bay Area, where a fourth of Jewish families include folks of color, where 23% of Jewish families are multilingual, and where a sense of intersectional Judaism or multicultural, multi-ethnic Judaism is continuing to grow. This is a trend. This is, you know, we're on the edge here, but we're a sign of what's coming. We need to better understand what's happening. And I think this is where not just understanding what our students needs, but what is the whole family experience around identity, around language, and ethnic identity formation. Sometimes we only look at Jewish students as Jewish students, but what is actually going on at home has to do with so many other identities. So in the case of Latin Jewish families, we have these themes also of immigration, of Latin Jewish immigrants, as well as interfaith families, where one parent might be Latino and not Jewish, and the other person might be Jewish and not Latino. And they are trying to figure out how their children will be Latin and Jewish. Are they going to send their kid to a Spanish immersion preschool or elementary, if there exists, or a Jewish school? How do they pick and choose and create an identity for their children? It's not something they are just transmitting. It is something that they are creating. And in doing so, they are actually transforming culture. They're creating hybrid cultures themselves through their family choices. And so I think this is where when educators say, wow, I have one kid who, you know, is from Venezuela, but his mom, what do I do for them? I think that educators and researchers, they really ought to look at what parents are doing, because parents are on this cutting edge of how do we integrate these sometimes contradictions? How do we navigate the things that we don't want from our inherited cultures and that we do want? How do we contend with a setting that might be, you know, very monolingually oriented and would affect how a child would see themselves? How do we contend with anti-Semitism in the Latino community and racism in the Jewish community? All of these are questions that parents are having to resolve internally. And so when teachers ask themselves, well, how do we do that? I think really asking parents how they're doing that is very powerful and kind of also speaks to what, Ilana, you were talking about in terms of the continuity between home and school. And we know that, you know, my focus has been on parents with young children, not adolescents. But, you know, ethnic identity formation also changes, you know, as children age through in a developmental aspect. So I think having a developmental approach to these questions of Jewish education, of ethnic identity formation, and the kinds of policies and practices that our institutions need to be embracing is important. And then the last piece I'll say is that in the wake of George Floyd and Black Lives Matter, I think that Jewish institutions really took it upon themselves to understand things like race, privilege, and power. I don't think they really looked at linguistic diversity in the same way. And language and identity are intrinsically connected. It's a main feature of Jewish diversity. So it's something for us to continue to look into. And then I also feel that some of the pedagogies that emerged from this time really focused on understanding differences between people, whereas in Jewish educational context, we have often focused on our similarities. I think what's new about the Latin Jewish experience and what it provokes us to think about as practitioners and also as researchers is that it's not just teaching about differences or similarities, but how we can be many things at the same time. How can you be Latino and Jewish? And how does that look differently for a family from El Salvador than from Chile, right? We're a very diverse community. Latinos are not a race. We're a multi-ethnic, multilingual, multinational community, just as Jews are. And so these programmatic experiments like Olamim, where we are centering Latin and Jewish culture together, integrating both, where no one feels like they're the only one because they're the only Jew or they're the only Latino, and really creates a fusion kind of experience brings in this marginal identity that in a Jewish context would be, you know, the thing that maybe parents would feel like, well, I don't really feel comfortable there. I don't really feel like I can participate, or I don't really want to put my kid in that school because they're going to be the only kid of color, or because they're going to lose all their Spanish. Really centering that otherness in our Jewish spaces, it not only brings people who are kind of out there into the center and brings out their own leadership and their own participation, but it models intercultural, intersectional life, which really is what it means to be Jewish, right? We have always been interculture, intersecting, multiple identities kind of people. And for some reason in the United States, we forgot how to engage all of that in an educational context. So I think my biggest excitement from the Olamim research on Latin Jewish families is to really be able to embrace again the multiplicity of what families are and what Jewish looks like and feels like in our community settings and in the classroom, and really looking at our families as Marva said, the experts, the people who are leading in practice, who can really help us understand how we innovate in this area.
Thank you so much for that. Ilana, tell us about what you hope practitioners and educators might take away from your important research.
Sure. I want to thank Ariella. I feel like the last few sentences of your presentation just now could have easily come out of my mouth, just based on all the things that I've been saying. And you so beautifully captured what I've been trying to convey in my work, which is that we can be many things at the same time. And you just said that so succinctly. And I really think that that's kind of at the root of what my research on discontinuities has been asking, which is, what does Judaism look like? What are expected forms of Judaism? And to what extent are those things perhaps in conflict with one another, or maybe they just don't tell the whole story? As part of my research, I looked into how these discontinuities came about and how there seems to be a dominance. I don't mean in terms of power, but just in terms of sheer numbers of Ashkenazi representation in the media, in academia, in rabbinic structures. I mean, very simply, for many, many years, there were more Ashkenazi Jews, and they had a lot of institutional power. Of course, there were very strong Sephardic communities in Brooklyn, in Seattle. I don't mean to discount them. Proportionally, they were fewer than the Ashkenazi Jews. But what happens then is that there's this expectation that if you tend to see a Jew looking a certain way, then that is what you consider to be Jewish. And then what happens to people who don't perhaps fit that model? So especially in day schools where students are learning about religious practice, about rituals, about their culture, what if there are discontinuities or misalignment between what they're learning in school and what they're learning at home, that can transmit messages to students about whose heritage is valued or is not valued, or who does or doesn't belong. And based on the interviews from my study, the adults reveal that seemingly insignificant classroom interactions, minor institutional policies, sometimes major, but often very minor, can inform these attitudes about Judaism, about themselves, about their identity, about their community. In some other work that I've been doing, I've been speaking with many day school leaders, many educators about how to make classrooms and school cultures more inclusive. And everybody's well-meaning. I have yet to meet an educator who does not think that it's important. I think part of the difficulty is that America, generally speaking, has a image of a Jew as an Ashkenazi Jew. When people say Jewish, they think Jerry Seinfeld, they think Mel Brooks. They're not thinking Paula Abdul, I think is a Sephardi Jew, but that is not how she's generally known. So you're contending with these broader American ideas. And then even from a religious perspective, if you've had educators who, for the most part, have been educated themselves in Ashkenazi institutions, and there have been, I found a list of like the top 200 or the top 250 Sephardic rabbinical authorities of the last 100 years, and only one was from the United States. So if that's the environment, it's kind of no wonder that teachers are at a loss and they want to help, but they don't necessarily know how. But I do think that there are really small but very meaningful and very impactful changes. School culture is shaped not only by policies and procedures, but also just by seemingly innocuous day-to-day decisions about teaching and programming. The primary influence when it came to teachers, based on the interviews, was the students' perceptions of their teachers' awareness and knowledge about the cultural heritage and ritualistic traditions of students from non-Ashkenazi backgrounds. The adults who reported experiencing the least dissonance and the greatest belonging shared classroom experiences where teachers were knowledgeable about Ashkenazi and Sephardi halachot, minhagim, liturgy. They didn't place primacy on one or the other. They presented all modes of practice as valid and as equivalent. They didn't use language like saying, we do this, Sephardim do this, which is what happened in some of the other schools. The implicit assumption there is that we are Ashkenazim and those Sephardim are something else. So for teachers who just said, Ashkenazim do this, Sephardim do this, or Sephardim do this, Ashkenazim do this, and presented these as equally valid, those students felt a much stronger sense of continuity and felt a much stronger sense of belonging, which suggests that a key way for educators to create more inclusive school cultures is really just to learn about the customs, the cultures, the histories of different Jewish communities, especially when the student body is diverse. And there are curricula available. It's a little self-plug. I just finished editing the Sephardi Mizrahi Education Toolkit, which was recently published by Jimena. I had the honor of editing it, and it's a compendium of resources and strategies. There are other organizations, the Sephardic Education Center, the Institute for Ideas and Ideals. There are a number of organizations that are putting out materials. I encourage any educators who want to learn more to seek out these resources. For school leaders to seek out these resources, this would be a great way to enhance professional development programs, to help educators identify which resources might be the best things for them. I think another key thing is that educators can pay attention to the physical classroom environment and the physical objects in that space, because objects do send messages about who or what is valued in a certain space. So if a bulletin board has portraits of famous rabbis and other, prominent Jewish heroes, schools that have a high ratio of Ashkenazic to Sephardic representation on the walls might convey that maybe we prioritize Ashkenazim over Sephardim, as opposed to having equal representation on the walls. Another key finding was with respect to prayer books. What sorts of sidurim, what sorts of liturgies are not just made available, but normalized within the school building. There were a number of adults who said that their schools only stocked Ashkenazi sidurim. So they had to either settle for what was available, or they would bring a sidur from home, and then they would literally be on a different page from most of their classmates. So that's something that schools can think about. How do we respect the different liturgical traditions and the different religious and cultural traditions of various communities, while still holding space for all of the communities together in one building?
Great. And Ilana, feel free to put a link into the chat to that curriculum. Okay, I wanted to, for those of you who haven't had a chance to read the articles, I might not realize this, but the data collection period for most of these authors generally spanned from like 2018, 2019 to 2021. So there was a lot of stuff going on in the world, including a big pandemic. And then just as our special issue got released, which was, I think, at the end of September, then there was October 7th. And so I wanted each of you to talk about how recent global or regional events, such as the pandemic, shifts in political and social climates. Ariella, you mentioned the George Floyd and racial justice protests, and the October 7th Hamas massacre in Israel influenced how either you conducted your research or the implications of your findings. I'm going to give you guys just a little bit of time, so try to keep your answers brief so that we can get to the last question and then also take the Q&A from the questions from the audience. So, Marva, can I have you start with that one?
Of course. I'll try to be really, really brief. I'll just, if it's okay, I'll start with the 10 months leading to October 7th, because, you know, my experience was so strange being an Israeli abroad. I came there for the Trump period, basically my entire PhD journey. And throughout that, when I told people that I was doing research with Ethiopian Jews on Ethiopian Jews, people were like, oh, so you're researching Blackness. You're researching the ideas of, you know, how does a Black Jewish community make sense in the whole front? And on the one hand, it was clear to me that that was part of the game. And on the other hand, I felt like as a Jewish studies researcher, I needed to see how that racism plays out in Jewishly, like how it speaks a Jewish tongue. And in many ways it did. And when I was sitting alone in my grad student dorm in California, I was reading like the Scroll of Independence and the Law of Return, how it changed from 1950 to 1970. And I was just so deep in these materials that made the social construction of Jewish identity happen. I'm learning so much from Elena and Ariella from your stories also about how schools function there. I learned that we learned in Israel to be 4 different kinds of Israelis, like ultra-religious and religious and secular and Arab, as if that's another category. And all these structures were so deep in my mind. And when I came back to Israel, all of a sudden people were talking about the problem of Israel's Jewish identity. All of a sudden people were, you know, who were making settlements, and thinking, you know, messianically that this is how this state should work, or others who were saying like, we will not join the army because learning Torah is more important. This became a Jewish battle, or a battle on what being a Jew is. And people started reading the Scroll of Independence, and I felt like a veteran. Like I knew in a way that what the Ethiopian Jews experienced in Israel, it's only a matter of time until we all do. And so in the drama that preceded October 7th, I felt like I could understand that this research taught me a lot about what Ashkenazi Jews in Israel can do and should do right now in order to make this society flourish in many ways. And then October 7th hit, and all of a sudden it was as if another story was in the subtext all along. And I think that from that moment onwards, my research participants and my friends of Ethiopian descent entered into a problem exactly with that, how they were framed in America as Blacks. All of a sudden, communities of color and organizations like Black Lives Matter were so openly, not only against the war, but against the idea that October 7th even happened. And many Ethiopian Israelis felt like their identities were just shifting. Like they started creating Black art and creating Black only spaces. And they had like their own ideas of how they relate to that global community. And all of a sudden they were taken out. I'm posting here on the chat if you'd like to.
You muted yourself.
Yes, so that's just one amazing officer of Ethiopian descent who talked about her own identity crisis with the war going on. And so I think that it opened up all the questions about Jewishness and Blackness that we were already thinking about.
Thank you so much. Hannah, I have a feeling you have stuff to say on this topic, because I know October 7th certainly impacted your research?
Yes, in a number of ways. So the paper that I'm primarily talking about today was the pilot study for my dissertation, which is to say that that study ended in 2021. But that I launched a whole new study in the San Francisco Bay Area in really late 2022, which spanned the judicial overhaul process in Israel and the sort of ramifications that held for global Jewry, and of course the October 7th massacre and the subsequent war. And there are a couple different dimensions here. One that I didn't mention so much before, but my work increasingly over time, I began to really dive into questions of what it means for Israelis in the diaspora to encounter religious establishment when seeking linguistic resources, and what that's like for them and how that process changes over time. And one thing that has always stuck with me from that whole from the paper that I'm thinking about a great deal right now is that they, in many ways, the parents I'm speaking to are importing some ideas about church and state that are really live for them in Israel and mapping them onto American Jewish institutional life. And if we don't really consider the news they're reading from home, the concerns of their family members who are, and their own concerns that Israel is becoming less recognizable to them when it comes to religious hegemony, we're missing some of the plot of how parents situate their families in the United States and what it means to be an Israeli abroad. So that's one piece. And the second piece, I was actively still recruiting for my dissertation when October 7th happened, and I stopped the study for the validity, but also because in that moment, the most important thing that I could do for my participants was make sure that they were okay, make sure that their families were alive, that their students, if there were teachers back in Israel, were alive and safe. And it really shifted my relationship with my participants, both the participants from LA who I hadn't spoken to in a little while, and also the people who I had been in active communication with. I thought for a moment that, I have to rewrite this whole thing. All of the research that I did before October 7th isn't valid because these individuals are not the same human beings I spoke to a month ago, 2 years ago, et cetera. Their lives have changed. The way they orient toward institutions have changed. The way that the trust that they have toward American public institutions, towards higher education, it runs the gamut. But at the same time, it just means that there's a lot more research to do on this community, especially since preliminary data is rolling in from the Jewish institutional sphere about how Israelis are engaging differently with Jewish communal institutions, how they're seeking affinity spaces, how they're showing up to synagogues in higher numbers, federations in higher numbers, what previously was sort of like a black box mystery for a lot of people who were sitting in powerful positions about how Israeli Americans engage Jewishly or engage with each other in the United States or engage with non-Israelis in the United States is now becoming an issue of critical concern for them. And what I'm hoping my research that I collected before October 7th, and also some of the conversations that now I'm having with my participants because time changes how we talk to each other, will inform how different community members and leaders and educators understand and begin to ask better questions about this community and their needs.
Thank you so much for that. Ilana, how about for you? How did things like COVID or October 7th or other social and political crises impact either the methods of your work or the implications of your work, or how it was received once it was published?
Sure. So I'll start just way back when I was planning my dissertation, the end of 2019, the beginning of 2020. Originally, I was planning on doing ethnographic observations in classrooms because the study of cultural discontinuities is usually rooted in anthropology or ethnography, because you need to observe a culture's behaviors in order to know what they are, in order to compare them to another culture's behaviors. Then, of course, COVID hit and I was not allowed into schools anymore, nor did I want to go into schools at that point. So I did have to change course, and I redesigned my study to interview adults who had gone through these K through 12 experiences. Ultimately, I think it did enhance my study and make it richer, because I was able to have conversations with the adults about what discontinuities meant for them at different life stages and how that impacted their ethnic and religious identity development as they got older. So I do think it ended up being for the best in a sort of twisted way. In terms of what the study meant after COVID, my study is rooted in the literature of school belonging and social emotional well-being, and there is ample data to suggest that students who do not feel represented in their schools are at risk for a whole host of psychosocial issues and at-risk behaviors, mental health disorders, substance abuse, etc. And all of this was exacerbated in the wake of COVID-19. So I do think that addressing issues of discontinuity and making efforts to enhance school belonging has always been important. It is especially important now. And with respect to October 7th, it's interesting. I've been doing some projects where I've been speaking with people of different non-Ashkenazi communities. And one of the topics that always comes up is how they identify when they have to fill out a census form. And I would say 9 out of 10 people sometimes they check white because there really isn't any other option, but they don't feel like they're white, and they don't feel like their identities are represented or even considered in a lot of the discourse today. And I think in the wake of October 7th, I'm thinking specifically about all the unrest we've been seeing on college campuses. There's been this narrative that's being peddled and is being accepted that Jewish people are this hulking, monolithic entity that looks like one thing. It's not only inaccurate, as we know, it's also very harmful. And I think that this work that we're doing, all of us with these journal articles, is really celebrating the richness and diversity of the Jewish world. And it's also pushing back against that narrative and showing like, hey, I know that it sounds very, politically trendy to present Jews in this one way, but it's not true. And it does not represent people within the community. So I think that this work is very important in establishing that Judaism is rich and multicultural, multi-ethnic, multilingual, and we're not all the same. We don't all look the same. And I'm going to go back to what Ariella said. We can also be many things at the same time.
Thank you. I'm actually going to take 1 or 2 of the audience questions before I ask the 4 of you to respond to the last question that I had prepared. So Ilana, this one is actually for you, and it comes from Wendy Rosov. She asks, thinking about your paper about discontinuities between the home and school, in their research about Jewish early childhood education and day school choice that Wendy and her colleagues at Rosov Consulting are doing, they often hear stories from parents that one of their primary motivations is to give their kids a firm foundation in Jewish life, something that they might feel they cannot offer because of their own limited backgrounds. And Wendy is wondering what happens then when the kids come home knowing or doing or wanting to do more than their parents know or want to do. And this also comes up in research on Jewish summer camp.
Yeah, so that would be one of my recommendations for subsequent research. I think that the topic of discontinuities, I focused on differences between Ashkenazi and Sephardi religious traditions, but issues of discontinuities and belonging could easily be transferred over to talking about different religious backgrounds or Jewish knowledge or Jewish practice in general. I think insofar as it came up in my research, the adults that I spoke with have conflicting feelings in hindsight. Some of them said they would come home from school and, the mother would be preparing Shabbat in a way that, using the warming drawer, the hot plate, whatever the utensil was, in a way that was fine. But she would come home and say, "No, Ma, you can't do that. That's not okay." And then it did end up creating this sort of tension. Then years later, once she read a little bit more and learned, she realized, like, oh, my mom wasn't wrong. I'm such a horrible daughter for saying that to her. So I think that a lot of this comes down to how are teachers presenting material, and what is the language that they're using when they're presenting material? Are educators presenting religious practice as this is the one way to do it? And it's an all or nothing zero-sum game. So I think that is probably where school culture does play a significant role.
Great. And Hannah, I think you might actually also have something to say on this topic.
Yeah, first I'll echo Alana's suggestion that we should have further research in this area. It's definitely an interest of mine as well. But this has come up in both of the projects I've done recently, in that many of the Israeli parents I've spoken to had their Jewish education funneled through the Israeli municipal secular school system, and they learned holiday songs growing up. They learned, different rituals, and they observed them with their families. Beyond that, most of them feel quite ill-equipped to give their kids anything more than that. And some of them are very happy with that being a limit, and others are curious about what else could come with further Jewish education. And I have a couple of key examples just really quickly, but there's a lot more I could say offline of a number of parents who had their kids in Jewish educational institutions by happy accident will say, the school closed for COVID, their kid didn't do well in larger learning settings to begin with, and they end up in a learning pod. And the kid is coming home saying all these blessings. And the mom, who I call Rovital, who originally came from Russia through Israel to the United States, is just beside herself. But at the same time, she says, I actually can't give my kid this. So, I'm kind of curious. I'm not really shutting this down as much as, I really don't believe in God. But, I'm curious, Hannah, do you know where I can get more resources for my kid who's curious about this, right? So I think there's, that bucket. And then you have, parents who kids are doing bar mitzvah lessons and things like that. And that's their first interface with, Jewish education, as we call it, as we might know it. And they all of a sudden want to be lighting candles and remind their mom to buy challah when they're at the store and things like that. And then you have cases where there's a shutdown. And I heard this really rich conversation between parents. I mostly spoke with mothers in both of these studies, but the dad came into the room and there was a really tense back and forth between Ofri, one of the participants, and her husband about whether their son should go to the Torah should say, should read from the Torah or get an Aliyah on the Torah at his bar mitzvah. And that was something that the father had no mental image of how that could possibly happen. And the mom said, he's goes to day school and that's a thing that, he's pretty comfortable with. And, they sort of quabble about it a little bit. And she had grown up part of her childhood in the United States and it was more familiar to her. So, she said, we'll get there when we get there. He's only 7 now. So there's a lot there and definitely more stories to pick up on as we go along.
Thank you so much for that. Okay, Marva, I'm going to ask you a question. And for other people who have questions, please post them in the QA section. One of our listeners is curious about how you deal with Ethiopians' own story of their biblical roots versus, this is the specific question, versus what the historical and genetic evidence tells us about the origins of this community.
Well, I thank you for your question. I actually want to start with a little story that the Ethiopian Jewish community was actually it lived in isolation for most of its history. And when the first, until the late 19th century, Jews from Europe and even from North Africa did not know that a Jewish community in Ethiopia actually exists. And so when the first representative of Kiach, of Kol Yisrael Chaverim, came to Ethiopia, Yosef Halevi told the first people that he saw that were named Falasha, it was a degrading term for a Jew in Ethiopia, he told them, I am Falasha like you. And they looked at him and they were like, what do you mean? There's no Falasha that looks like you. Are you sick or something? Do you need to eat? And that was a very funny moment in which their world of Jewish identity did not intersect with the world of Jewish identity outside of them. And so even, you know, the history of Ethiopian Jews in the eyes of the science is a history of questioning and doubting. And that was really, when I came into this field, I realized that that from the very first instances, people were very, very doubtful about whether or not a Jewish community in Ethiopia could actually exist. That genetic evidence, actually, a study that was done in the 50s, I think, tried to examine Jews, you know, where did they take the data from Poland? So they didn't, you know, it's not, they proved what they were assuming in the first place. And I think that when we talk about Jewish identity, which is something that I think is a little bit sacred, like you cannot tell another person if they are a Jew or not. I think that in Israel, it's maybe it's the most secular state because the state can tell you if you are a Jew or not. But a person that sees their Jewishness as part of the lineage that they grew up in, and of course is a part of their identity and their faith and their soul and their ethics. So it's not up to anyone else to say something like this. You know, the first one of the first papers about Ethiopian Jews was called The Invention of Ethiopian Jews. And one day when I'll be good and strong, I will write a paper that is called The Invention of Ethiopian Jews, because I think that how science tried to understand this community in its own terms is not, in a way, is too loyal to the wrong principles of science. And the last thing I want to say about this is that actually there is a great connection between the biblical ideas of biblical Judaism, actually, and the way Ethiopian Judaism is built. Their sacred text is called the Orit, and it's a portion of the Bible that they sanctify. They preserve laws of purity of blood, and even the purity of marriage relations in ways, and even of kosher food in ways that later in the diaspora, the halakha tried to kind of, you know, maneuver it. And so I wouldn't undermine the community's own narrative of their Jewish identity. And I think that if a whole community of 10,000 people, you know, we just celebrated Passover, that they walked through the desert with that idea of Jerusalem in mind, I think that to do that as a whole community, you need to cultivate multiple generations of something that we can call being a Jew.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. I'm going to ask the last question that I had prepared. I recognize that we only have a few minutes, but I do want to give you guys a chance to answer this briefly. So after reading each other's articles in this special issue, how has your understanding of the intersections of race, ethnicity, and immigration in Jewish education been enhanced or altered? I'm curious if there are particular insights or themes from each other's work that resonated with you or influenced your thinking about your own research going forward, or its implications. Ariella, do you want to take that? Do you want to start with that one in any way?
Sure. I think for me, this research is all so rich and it's so unique, and we need so much more. I think that you can see that there's so many more questions underneath what our findings are, and that our community is shifting. It's shifting because of the stakes and the priorities that we have as Jewish communal leaders. It's shifting because of the way that we are understood by others. And so there's a lot to keep digging into. I think probably one of the most important things from our work is the importance of research and practice being connected, and to support educational leaders in asking questions about their communities and what matters to them, and how to build more bridges between school and home, more continuity how to support parents in their own ethnic identity development, understanding that parents are also part of our community. They're also on a journey, as Hannah said, and as is very evident in our work as well. And so I think that this research together really shows the work that still needs to be done around accompanying youth, teachers, and institutional leaders in continuing to truly understand what our needs are, what our context is, and not only in building critiques, but in developing new possibilities. And that's what's most exciting to me about my work and about what all of this research points to.
Thank you, Ariella. Hannah, how about for you?
Similarly, there were a number of points that came up for me, but the first is about how we go about talking to people. I think the positionality pieces were really, really stark for me. As it's aside from Ariella, the remaining three of us were jumping into environments that we knew well, but were not our own, and thinking about how we actually coach. So it's what Ariella was saying, how we coach others to ask to engage with these communities and these individuals. And I had a call recently that really made that point hit home. Somebody was asking me about, a program at a JCC in New Jersey, and how she might be able to accommodate the Israeli community there. And I said, have you spoken to people in the community? And I walked this individual through, different ways to reach the people whose voices needed to be a part of that conversation. And that's a strength that I think all of your work really does, in terms of really playing that dynamic for somebody for whom that might be a new experience or something that they haven't done recently.
Thanks. Marva, how about for you?
Well, I think there are also so many points of similarity. I will only try to hit one little point home. I think that all of you spoke so beautifully about what Ariella called, I think, like the intersectionality that we can't escape as Jews. Like, each of us works with the community that has to rebuild or to work up the connections between the different kinds, and the tensions between the different identities that they hold simultaneously. And what I think that connects us all is the notion that intersectionality, or that identity that is multiple and not neatly fitting into the categories, this is what Jewishness in a way is. And in the Israeli context, it's even more surprising, because Israel tried to see like a state. It tried to create the new Jew that is one. And we see now that this effort is just futile, and it brings the worst results. And so I think that studies like the ones that I read in this special issue can actually show us what an asset this diversity is for us as Jews, and this is the main tool for our future worldwide. So that's
Thank you. Thanks, Marva. Ilana, close us out before, and then Liz will, I think, share a little bit about some of the upcoming sessions.
Sure, I'll say that this is not surprising, but very affirming. I become, as I'm sure many of us have, especially in the wake of October 7th, become very disenchanted with academia. And I've been feeling a lot that a lot of work, especially work that's grounded in theories that may or may not apply to 2024 Judaism, really serve to undermine and to tear down and to denigrate, and then publish it and then call it scholarship. And I think I feel very hopeful in this panel, because I think all of us are coming to our topics and our subjects from a place of love, from a place of investment, from a place of wanting to build and to make things better. And that gives me hope.
That's such a beautiful way to close it out. I couldn't agree more. Really, it was such an honor and a privilege to get to guest edit this issue and to get to engage with the work of these amazing scholars. Thank you all for joining us today.